This is a continuation of an interview with Dr. Rainman and Dr. Lippitt on negotiating with your management team. Let me ask you to respond to some specific types of negotiating dynamics that occur during meetings, and I see that one of your chapters in your book is entitled Some Things That Come Up in Meetings, Ideas on What to Do. For example, you talk about cutting a long-winded speaker or coping with latecomers. Coping with a high-status person is something that I think I'd especially ask you to respond to. Stimulating a non-reactive passive group. How would you deal with some of those aspects of the dynamics that occur during meetings?
Let me take the last one, the stimulating a non-reactive passive group, and I'll leave the high-status persons around. I think that there is no such thing as a passive, non-reactive group, really. Sometimes their past history has led them to behave that way because it's expected, or because meetings have been boring, or because meetings have been totally non-participatory. So it seems to me that all of the things that we've said around seating arrangements for small groups, around doing something the moment they come in, like the thing that we refer to as a raggedy beginning in our book, so that as people come in they have a task to do, or a person to meet, or persons to meet, that gets utilized as part of the business of the meeting rather than sitting and waiting for the thing to begin. The whole physical arrangement, when people walk in, they're not nearly as apt to be passive when they sit in groups of 3, 4, and 5 than if they sit in rows of chairs and think all wisdom will come from the podium. So that, I think that's one of the easier things to do, provided the conveners really want a group to participate. And I underline that provided, because some conveners like non-reactive passive groups, because then they can do their thing. And they can say, well, they didn't say anything. And that becomes a justification, you see, for either misvoting or misinformation, or a whole lot of games that get played that way. So I see it as an interesting but a terribly easy to cope with issue. Why don't you take that high-status person? What would you do with him or her?
Well, it seems to me that one thing we've discovered is that one needs to prevent, in the early stages of meetings, a high-status person from suddenly creating an audience, the rest of the group becoming an audience for spokesmanship. And as we mentioned, one way to do that is to do early work in small groups. So the status person is just a member of one of the groups that's going to be reporting out the ideas from their groups. A second thing that very frequently I think is helpful is to, as Eva mentioned earlier, have a group develop its norms about the way time is going to be distributed, and that everybody's going to have 1 minute to present ideas before we go on to further participation. A third procedure is to really take the high-status person into your confidence as a helper. Before the meeting, I recently worked with a bishop in a meeting with his program council, and we were going to get into some controversial issues. And I said, Bishop, how do you think your role should be played so that we can get out the maximum range of ideas and feelings there are in that group? And he paused and said, well, I guess I shouldn't say anything first. And I said, I think that's probably right. So why don't you think in terms of that as we go along in the meeting? And he did a very effective job then of letting other people talk before, and then somebody would turn to him partway through and say, well, Bishop, you haven't said anything yet. What do you think? He said, well, I'm trying to listen to everybody and see how that relates to what's been going around in my head, and I'd like to hear a little more.
I think another fourth method is, for instance, in industry, if you have the top management with middle or other levels of management, is to utilize brainstorming and to have very mixed groups where after 2 minutes people forget totally who's around that table because they're interested in the product. And whether the product is all the ways to improve training around here, or all the ways that we think upward mobility could be a more visible part of the incentives of working here, or whatever it happens to be. I've had terribly good experience with top management people, so long as they're not all at one table, getting involved very quickly with a group when that method is used, and the group getting over their dis-ease very quickly. How high-status people are introduced. And one of the things we've both done is rather than introducing them with all of their credentials and how long they sat in school and got which degree where, we tend to involve them in the process very quickly by interviewing them to introduce them. So that, for example, if the president of Whoop-de-Doo Corporation is going to be in a meeting, we might do an interview of him saying, now, Mr. So-and-so, we're very glad you're here and we want to talk a little bit with you about what your hopes are for today. What do you hope will happen here, and what are some of the reasons, from your point of view, why you're backing this venture? And I had an experience with the head of a large state department not very long ago, in which I started that way, and it really decreased the distance between the people sitting in the room and this gentleman, because a couple of people in the room said to him, well, you're here for the same reasons we are, that's interesting. And boom, you know, we were off and running. So that's another way, I think, to utilize their status, but to also let people know that they aren't all that different.
See, I think one of the main points in one's attitude toward dealing with the high status question is that I think it's important not to have the attitude, how can we prevent him from speaking so much, or how can we prevent him from throwing his weight around? The question is, how can we involve him in seeing his responsibility for helping the whole group be productive?
How do you deal with a long-winded speaker?
Well, I think there are lots of ways. One is, of course, if you know it beforehand, to have an agreement with that person about warnings on time, right? Or another way is to do that publicly and to agree that at the end of 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is that's agreed upon, you will warn that person. So it's publicly agreed upon, and when you do it, the audience doesn't think that you're being impolite or whatever. But I have another method which is not as nice as either of those two, and that is I tend to watch breathing patterns. And when a person is taking a breath, interrupt and say, let me see if I can summarize what you've said so far. For instance, in a meeting where they're not speaking to an audience in the same way that you do when you have a prepared paper. And let's see whether I've gotten you so far. And then that person has to say, yes, you have, or no, you haven't. And then I may say, now what I'd like to do is see if we can move to somebody else and come back to you. Or if you need another minute to finish, we'll give you another minute. But you literally interrupt.
Yeah, that's a technique that I also use very often. I'll say, gee, you've already given us 3 ideas, and it's going to take us a little while to digest those. You probably have more that we'll need to get into later, but let's just use those 3 ideas right now and get some others from some other folks.
There's a principle behind this, I think, and that is if you happen to be leading the meeting or helping plan it, and you know that this is going to come up, you've got to look at the health of the total group versus the momentary discomfort of a person. Mm-hmm. And if I believe that the long-winded speaker is ruining the health of the total group, I don't have any problem thinking up some way to interrupt that person.
How do you deal with latecomers?
I think there are lots of ways. For example, in large meetings, to leave an empty chair at several tables so you don't have all the latecomers at one table, so that as they come in, whoever is greeting and meeting and seating them, they can direct the latecomer to a table that is already constituted and where he or she becomes a part of it very quickly. I think another one is to have raggedy beginnings, so that there is no possibility of being late. Some people just come sooner and some come later, and those will come later click into whatever activity is going on as they come in. I certainly think, thirdly, that the process that is used in most meetings to make a big deal of the latecomer is probably the best way to click that person out of the meeting forever, at least forever that day, because they make the person feels guilty, and then they have to think up some socially acceptable reason why they were late, and then everything gets interrupted and you've lost their resources. So it seems to me it's very important to find ways to help people who are later than other people feel comfortable, so they can at least utilize what they have to offer once they're there.
And you can usually get a couple of collaborating members of the group to be the orienters of those who've just arrived. They can be near the door or sitting near the door if it's a large meeting. You can have a little whispered orientation of what's going on.
I'm interested in understanding the conditions under which a meeting leader should be collaborative, should initiate initiative and the free exchange of ideas, and under conditions which that meeting leader should not? Are there different types of meetings in which different approaches towards that meeting should be used? Sometimes more collaborative and sometimes more directive?
Are you using collaborative meaning participatory?
Yes.
Most meetings can be participatory, and that it would be a lot more helpful to any leader to have participation from the group.
I agree with you, Eva. I guess I'm trying to understand maybe there might be some situations in which the leader cannot do this. It's just, time pressures, for example, might inhibit that, or there may be a decision that needs to require more directive approach to decision making.
Yeah, I get worried though. Time pressures are always used as the excuse for not utilizing participation. I'd say have less agenda items and do them with participation. So time pressures is not a reason for me. But maybe straight information. Now there may be a time when the group, in order to make a decision or in order to think about something or just in order to exist, needs information, which, you know, I think can be given in lots of other ways than telling it to people, because I think that's the least effective. But sometimes the material isn't ready, or it's an emergency piece of information, and I can see that the leader at that point either needs to appoint someone to give that information, or the leader himself or herself has to give it. And yet, I guess at the end of giving the information, I'd still invite group participation in reaction to the information.
Well, and actually you could make information getting and giving a participative kind of activity. Often,
Absolutely.
Often where a technical resource person is needed to give the kind of information that the group will need to discuss in order to make a decision, for example, it's quite possible to have the resource person either in the back of the room or at the front of the room, and you get the group in small groups buzzing on the kinds of questions that they're going to need to get information on in order to deal with that decision. And those are being listed up in the front. And then you bring up your resource person and you say, Dr. So-and-so, you've heard us and where we are, and probably you're wondering why some of the questions that we haven't asked, why we haven't. Because probably you know that we need some kinds of information that we haven't known enough to ask for. So here's a space over here. Would you tell us the questions we should have asked that we haven't yet? And let's get those up too. And then with the questions that everybody's warmed up that they know they need, and these now that they're ready to listen to because of the way it's been handled, then there can be an active question and answer period and a presentation period with the resource expert, which people are really listening because they know they need it, they've identified the needs, they're getting it down because they know they're going to make a decision from it.
Yeah, I think there's another, if I could just give one other technique for information giving. I have been working with groups that know very little about the recent trends in the volunteer world. So there isn't any point starting with what do you think they are, the non-knowledgeable, non-experienced groups in this area. I've picked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trends, whatever, but after each 2, we'll divide the room, for example, into subgroups to say what implications does this trend have for your community or for your organization. Or another time I'll stop and say, what questions does this trend raise? So even with straight information being given to a relatively non-knowledgeable group, and I say relatively because there's always knowledge in a group, there are still ways that you can involve them. And I think the cost of non-involvement for me is too great to ever not want to find a way to involve a group, whether in a business meeting or another kind of meeting, some way so that they have some ownership of that meeting and some say-so about the direction that it takes.
Well, let me pose another condition. Say a meeting leader is just starting with his or her management team to use a more collaborative, participative approach in the business meetings. I get concerned that possibly the member is not being ready for this type of process.
Well, why can't that person plan the meeting with a few of the members in the first place? So that instead of, if you're going to, especially if you're going to do team building, well, better way to do it than to have a team that plans it. And if some of the people in the group have had some participation in the planning of that event, they'll help the leader.
What types of pre-planning things could that leader do to ensure that collaborative problem-solving approach?
Well, for example, the leader might...
Arrange the room.
Yeah, arrange the room would be one. Another one would be to pose the kinds of things that he or she thinks need to get discussed and ask the team, how might we do it? what are some ways we might get at this? What do you think our gang would be most responsive to, and have, and hopefully have some ideas up his or her sleeve from books like ours and others that are available, or from other experiences.
Well, sometimes, though, a leader gets frustrated at this process because of some of the games that the subordinates play, which may be the leader's fault, or maybe because of the whole environment in which that organization
Okay, but in
is
most
formed.
organizations, then there's somebody who he or she can call on. That is, there are organizational development consultants within many organizations who would help plan meetings. And if they aren't within, certainly they're available outside.
But don't the subordinates try to hook or test the meeting leader?
That's why I say the subordinates ought to be in there and helping plan it, you see. I mean, they don't always try to hook or test. I think some subordinates do, some don't. And if the person isn't very experienced in planning with people, the very simplest methodology might be to interview a few of the people and say, what do you hope will happen at that meeting? Or what are some of the things you think we need to be discussing? So they've had some little input into the meeting, other than the department head coming and announcing, today our agenda is, and we shall go about it in the following ways.
I had recently a president of a company that wanted to make some shifts in a staff meeting of the kind you're talking about. And we developed a 5-minute startup, which we call an internal dialogue. As they came in and sat in their chairs, they found in front of them a little slip which said, before we start talking with each other today, we'd like to ask you to talk with yourselves. Would you listen to the voices that are inside of you that are actively talking on these two topics? And there were 2 columns. One, all the voices that are saying that there are some risks to taking too much initiative or speaking up in this meeting, and all the voices saying it would be a good idea to become more active and to speak up more than I do in this meeting. And just write them down as quotes, as you can hear them. And then they were collected and passed around, and everybody got one that wasn't his own, and they read them out and talked about what. And the president then said, okay, now what I want us to listen to are what are the conditions we could have in these meetings so that we could support the voices for being more active and taking more initiative, and it would decrease the conditions of the voices we've heard, because they were hearing all these voices now being read off, you see.
But of course you had a president who was ready to do that.
Oh yeah,
he was ready. Talking about some people.
He was concerned about the past tradition of the authoritarian.
But the frustrated person who says the democratic process takes too much time, I think another way is not to pounce on him and say have this kind of a meeting, but to expose that kind of leader to some participatory meetings of high quality where he or she can see that not only doesn't take more time, it builds less resistance and takes less time in the long run. So sometimes it's a matter of exposure. You can't really convince somebody it takes less time by talking about it. They've got to experience it in some way.
Meetings are an important part of a manager's life. In face-to-face encounters with other team members of his or her organization, problems are raised, information is shared, new ideas are developed, and decisions are made. In an important way, a meeting signifies the management team. Those present belong, those absent do not. A meeting is often the only occasion where a group exists and works as a team. Here the manager is actually perceived as the team leader rather than the authority figure to whom subordinates individually report. Meetings should be an exciting and rewarding part of being a member of an organization. Unfortunately, this is seldom the case. Most meetings are characterized by hidden agendas, lack of openness, and a waste of time and talent. This produces a high level of frustration for those involved, and as a result, reduces the team's effectiveness. A key element in making meetings more effective centers on methods of influence. How a superior attempts to influence his or her subordinates is a crucial factor in determining how open or closed they will be and whether the superior can gain their support and cooperation. Subordinates are usually aware that the superior can reward or punish their actions. So rather than the free flow of information, subordinates participate in a manner calculated to win their superior's approval. Eva and Ron stressed the importance of team building. they emphasize that superiors who influence their subordinates through participation and collaboration in the planning and conducting of meetings achieve better productivity. These superiors encourage openness and contributions from each member. They are sensitive to group processes and the interaction between members while the team is working to solve problems and make decisions. In addition, they are sensitive to recognizing and dealing with the anxieties and common defense mechanisms often present in groups. They encourage and promote a supportive and secure environment. Paramount in helping subordinates develop this sense of security and adequacy centers on the question of status. Status can have a serious negative effect on a management team's capacity to resolve conflict. A meeting is a status arena in which there is an implicit recognition of a superior's authority. Whether or not he or she chooses to exercise that authority is irrelevant. In either case, subordinates realize the possibility of retaliation. As a result, hierarchical status often acts as a strong deterrent on the willingness of team members to voice their opinions. This condition destroys one of the main advantages of a team approach to creative problem solving, the sharing of diverse ideas and information. Eva and Ron suggested several ways a superior can reduce the impact of status and increase the level and quality of contributions from the members of a management team. Several other guidelines are helpful. Be patient with the group's progress, especially on difficult problems. Accept more responsibility than may be appropriate for any failure or mistake. Give credit to the team and its members for their successes. Encourage the team to express their thoughts before stating your own. State your contributions in the form of questions, and encourage the team to evaluate your ideas. Eva and Ron suggested several methods which a leader could take to put these guidelines into action. Subgrouping, participation by the subordinates in planning the meeting, seating arrangements, brainstorming, and several more. Another method to increase subordinate participation is through structured communications, methods which are somewhat similar to brainstorming but more formalized. One type of structured communications is called the Nominal Group Technique, or NGT. NGT is used to enhance the generation and exploration of ideas to solve problems. Most communication between members of a group takes place with minimal structuring or control. In the nominal group, however, individuals work in the presence of others, but do not interact verbally except at specified times. Ideas are generated by each person and are shared and listed on flip chart pads for all group members to see. NGT, then, is a structured meeting in which information is generated and shared in an orderly fashion. The steps in the nominal group technique take a specific order. First, the statement of the problem is presented to the group. Second, group members are then asked to think through all possible solutions to the problem. This is done in a time period and without talking to each other. In the third step, with one person acting as a recorder, each person's ideas are listed on a flip chart. This process continues without discussion until all ideas have been listed. In the fourth step, the group recorder leads the group in a discussion. Each idea is clarified and evaluated one at a time. No items are eliminated from the list. In the fifth and final step, each participant, without interacting with each other, selects the 5 or 10 most important items on the total list. The group member then ranks the selected ideas as to how effective they will be in solving the problem. The idea ranked highest then becomes the group's solution to the problem. The nominal group technique has several advantages over unstructured discussions. It allows members to have time for uninterrupted thought and provides an opportunity for all members of a group to share in the decision-making process. The NGT process gets the ideas listed visually for everyone to see. Ideas and solutions are depersonalized because these ideas are put up on a flip chart. There is an orderly period of discussion of each idea, and when the decision is reached, it is truly a group decision. In addition to his concern about task, a superior should see his role more as a facilitator of the decision-making process. And in serving as a facilitator, he should be concerned with the following ground rules for collaboration. Are individuals expressing their personal opinions rather than just representing their own department or unit? Are all views represented, even those whose views are in conflict with each other? Are diverse opinions and perspectives allowed to come out? Is all information clearly described and presented before interpretations and evaluations are considered? Is sufficient time spent identifying the problem to get past the symptoms to its real root causes? Is there a concern for the feelings of the team members? Are ideas evaluated on their potential to solve the problem rather than their conformity to precedent? Are ideas evaluated on the basis of facts rather than opinions? Are parties willing to consider the needs of others in making decisions? Does each group member know his principles and preferences? In other words, do they know what they can't give on and what they can? Are these principles and preferences known to the group? In conclusion, the guidelines and the team-building methods we have examined are designed to make negotiating with our management teams both a more productive and human experience.